and be silent! Do not be scared!
On the 2nd of February 1943, the last stronghold of the German army in Stalingrad surrenders. The noise ceases, there is no celebration, there are no cheers, only silence, smoke, and cold. There are more than 1 million dead in a space that does not exceed 60 kilometers along the Volga. The bodies are in the streets, in the cellars, under the rubble, floating in the river. They are frozen on the slopes of a hill that changed hands more than 40 times. They're buried half a meter deep under the frozen steppe, in graves that no one marked. They are at the bottom of the Volga, trapped in the sediment, and they will never leave. On August 23, 1942, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, the sky over Stalingrad fills with German planes. The 4th Air Fleet of General Wolfram von Richthofen, the same commander of the Condor Legion who had coordinated the bombing of Guernica 5 years earlier, launches on the city the most intense air attack that the Second World War will have recorded until that moment on the Eastern Front. In the space of a few hours, the Luftwaffe carries out more than 1,000 sorties. Incendiary bombs fall on the wooden residential neighborhoods of the north and center of the city. High explosive bombs destroy the brick buildings, fragmentation bombs devastate the streets. The neighborhoods built mainly with wood, which constitute the largest part of the peripheral residential fabric of Stalingrad, become a firestorm. The flames from one building ignite the next. The streets become corridors of fire. People who cannot escape die charred or suffocated in the cellars where they had taken refuge seeking protection against the bombs. The oil depots located along the bank of the Volga burn, releasing columns of black smoke that tint the sky for days and that are visible dozens of kilometers away. The survivors who left testimonies decades later repeatedly used the same word, apocalypse, not as a literary metaphor, but as a description of what their eyes saw. They had no other reference. Estimates of victims on that single day vary between 40,000 and 70,000 dead civilians. The exact figure will never be established with precision. That is, in technical terms, the first problem. From the first moment, the dead of Stalingrad exceed in number any capacity for registration, management, or counting. The chaos is total. The functional system of death registration that a city of 445,000 inhabitants would have in normal times simply ceases to exist that day. On that same August 23rd, the German 14th Panzer Corps breaks the Soviet lines north of the city and reaches the Volga, momentarily cutting off land communication with the rest of the country. It is the first temporary encirclement, the first warning of what is to come. There is a detail about that August day that military analyses tend to overlook, but which is fundamental to understanding the scale of the subsequent human disaster. The evacuation of the civilian population of Stalingrad, which should have been completed weeks or months before as the front approached, has been blocked by direct order of Stalin himself. The logic of the dictator is macabre, but has a certain coherence from a military perspective. A city full of civilians forces the defenders to fight for a space that someone inhabits that represents something. An evacuated city is just a pile of stones. The civilians who remain are a psychological anchor for the defenders, a reminder of what is being defended. The price of that logic, which Stalin himself will never publicly acknowledge, is measured in tens of thousands of civilian lives that are not evacuated in time. When the partial evacuation is finally allowed, the only available corridor is the Volga, and the Volga is under constant fire from German artillery and aviation. The barges, the river steamships, the improvised boats with which they try to cross the kilometer of water that separates the besieged western bank from the Soviet eastern bank, do so in the darkness, trying to avoid the projectiles. The searchlights of the ships are off. The engines run at half speed to reduce noise. Many vessels are hit. The survivors who manage to cross will describe for the rest of their lives the surface of the Volga illuminated by the fires on the shore, with bodies floating among the remains of the sunken vessels and the first fragments of autumn ice. Those who die in the river during these evacuations are the first of a special category of dead that will have long-term consequences. the dead in the water, those who will never be recovered, those whom the vulgar keeps until today. The first combats within the urban perimeter proper begin on September 13, 1942. From that day, the dead of Stalingrad begin to accumulate in a progression that no human force can manage. The urban battle, the longest, the most brutal, the deadliest, has just begun. 24 hours. That was the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier newly arrived in Stalingrad during the worst moments of the battle. It is not a rhetorical or propagandistic figure. It appears in the reports of the political commissars of the 62nd Army and in the memoranda to the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, as justification for the need to send continuous reinforcements. A man crossed the Volga at night under German fire, reached the western bank, was assigned to a unit that could be 20 meters from the enemy, and in many cases did not live to see the next dawn. The urban Battle of Stalingrad generated a type of combat for which neither of the two armies had trained. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, in reference to the combat that took place in the sewer systems, in the cellars, in the spaces between walls. The Soviets simply called it hell and sought no other term. Combats took place building by building, floor by floor, room by room. Hand grenades were more useful than rifles in those spaces. Snipers dominated open spaces, turning any street into a death zone that could only be crossed by rolling, crawling, or running at maximum speed in the hope that the shooter would miss. Vasily Zaitsev, the Soviet sniper who would become a legendary figure of the battle, will accumulate 225 confirmed kills shooting from positions hidden in the rubble. The German sniper Major Erwin Koenig was sent specifically from Berlin to eliminate him in a duel that would last days and ended with the death of the German. Crossing a street could cost a life. Poking one's head above a parapet for more than 2 seconds was enough to die. Time and space were distorted in urban warfare of this scale. The Mamayev Kurgan, an elevation of 102 meters above sea level that dominates a good part of the city and which Soviet military maps designated simply as Height 102, changes hands during the battle with a frequency that defies any attempt at precise accounting. There are days when the summit changes hands several times. The soldiers who survive taking the summit know that the counterattack will arrive in hours. Those who die in the assaults are left lying on the slopes, in the shell craters, in the improvised trenches that are dug and redug in the same ground again and again. When the battle ends, the earth of that hill will be so saturated with shrapnel, bone fragments, and organic matter that metal detectors will be practically useless on it. The Soviet engineers who will study it later will document between 500 and 1,250 fragments of metal per square meter of surface. The hill will take years to recover vegetation because the hot metal that saturates the soil raises the temperature enough to prevent the growth of roots during the first springs of the post-war period. Estimates from researchers who have worked on the Mamayev Kurgan since the 80s calculate that between 34,000 and 35,000 people are buried under that hill. Many of them unidentified, many at shallow depth, some still in the exact posture in which they fell when the shrapnel hit them. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricadi complex, the Red October plant, each industrial facility becomes a fortress with its own combat logic. The attackers must take each industrial shed, each corridor, each metal platform suspended over the void 10 meters from the ground. The structures of steel and reinforced concrete resist the bombings and create almost impregnable defensive labyrinths. Inside these factories, the corpses remain for weeks in places that no recovery team can access, under machinery overturned by the bombings, in inspection wells, in the spaces between the load-bearing walls that Soviet construction engineers had designed to support the weight of heavy machinery and which now support the weight of nameless dead. Some of these spaces will not be accessible until decades later, when post-war demolitions reach those structures. There are testimonies from construction workers from the 60s who found skeletons sitting in the darkness of spaces that no one had opened since 1943. Skeletons with equipment still on, in some cases with legible documents stuck to the inside of the clothing. Casualties are catastrophic on both sides, but the asymmetry of human consumption is statistically dizzying. The Soviet historian Viktor Nekrasov, who fought in Stalingrad and wrote about it in his 1946 work In the Trenches of Stalingrad, described the feeling that the army was an entity that the battle was methodically devouring, that the reinforcements that arrived across the Volga at night were simply the next mouthful of a machine that was never sated. During the months of urban battle, the Red Army sent to the Stalingrad front approximately the equivalent of an entire division each day, just to maintain basic combat capacity. A Soviet division nominally has between 8,000 and 12,000 men. The arithmetic is brutal. At the height of the urban fighting, Stalingrad consumed between 8,000 and 12,000 men a day in casualties of all kinds, dead, seriously wounded, missing, and the distinction between those categories was often purely administrative. Regiments that existed on paper were reduced in days to a few hundred men, then to dozens. The 13th Guards Rifle Division of General Alexander Rodimtsev, which crossed the Volga on the night of September 14th to 15th, 1942, with approximately 10,000 men, had the following day fewer than 300 operational survivors. They had crossed the river under direct fire and had entered combat immediately in the center of the city. The rest had been left in the river or in the streets during the first 12 hours. This unprecedented human consumption is the direct source of the problem that the Soviet authorities will have to face when the battle ends. There is no possible planning for a situation in which the dead accumulate at that rate. There is no manual of procedures, there is no doctrine for casualty management. There is nothing that approaches a prepared institutional response. On November 19, 1942, at 7:20 in the morning, Moscow time, the Soviet artillery opens fire along the northern front of the Stalingrad pocket. The following day, November 20th, the southern front joins the attack. It is the beginning of Operation Uranus, designed in secret for weeks by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky. The plan is elegant in its brutality. The flanks of the German Sixth Army are not covered by German troops, but by the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, with clearly inferior equipment, without adequate anti-tank artillery to face the Soviet T-34s, and with little motivation to defend Soviet soil thousands of kilometers from their own country. The Romanian Third Army covers a strip of 140 kilometers along the Don to the north, with 9 divisions and some 152,000 men. The Romanian Fourth Army covers the steppe to the south. They are the weak links in the chain. German intelligence did not detect the concentration of Soviet forces. Troop movements had been carried out at night, with absolute radio discipline and a level of operational camouflage that the German General Staff had not anticipated. The Soviet armored divisions break the Romanian lines with relative ease. Katyusha rockets devastate the artillery positions. Soviet tanks advance in depth at a speed that exceeds even the most optimistic forecasts of the Stavka. The Romanian Third Army suffers nearly 90,000 casualties in 4 days of combat, including dead, wounded and prisoners. On November 23rd, the 2 arms of the Soviet pincer close at Kalach-on-Don. The German Sixth Army, along with units of the 4th Panzer Army and the remains of the trapped Romanian forces, is surrounded. Approximately 290,000 men, with their heavy equipment, their field hospitals, their artillery parks, their ammunition depots and their horses, are locked inside a perimeter that the Soviets call the Kessel, the kettle. Hitler prohibits the breakout attempt. He declares Stalingrad a fortress and promises that the Luftwaffe will supply the army by air. General Hans Jeschonek, chief of the air staff, endorses the promise before Hitler. It is a technically impossible promise. The Sixth Army needs a minimum of 500 tons of supplies daily to remain operational. The Luftwaffe, on its best flying days with favorable weather and all available planes, delivers just over 100 tons. On most days it delivers much less. The difference between what was promised and what was possible is measured in cold, in hunger and in corpses. The external relief attempt, Operation Winterstorm, under the command of Marshal Erich von Manstein, fails in December. Army Group Don cannot break the Soviet encirclement. By December 24th, the Soviets launch Operation Little Saturn, which pushes Manstein's forces to the west. The Sixth Army has no escape. Inside the kettle, the deterioration follows an implacable mathematical logic. Food rations are progressively reduced. In December, a German soldier in Stalingrad receives between 100 and 200 grams of bread a day, with a small amount of watery soup. It is a minimal fraction of the caloric intake necessary to stay active in temperatures that drop to 30 and 40 degrees Celsius. Extreme malnutrition weakens the immune system and causes minor wounds to become infected, diseases that in normal conditions would be trivial to become deadly. Horses are the first resource for subsistence. The horses that the army had used for the transport of artillery and supplies are slaughtered and consumed as soon as they die, with a veracity that the soldiers themselves describe in their letters home with shame and yet without any other possible alternative. When the horses are exhausted, they turn to rats, which proliferate without control in the destroyed city. Testimonies of survivors, collected in the archives of the German Federal Ministry of Defense and in the holdings of the Ludwig Boltzmann Documentation Center in Vienna, consistently mention this detail as one of the most demoralizing of the experience of the kettle. There are signs of cannibalism in the final weeks of the encirclement, recorded fragmentarily but consistently in the Soviet NKVD reports on the first prisoners captured in January 1943. The records mention at least one documented case among the prisoners processed in that period, and several more that were investigated without a definitive conclusion. It is a detail that the official narrative of both sides has tended to silence, but that researchers who have systematically worked with German survivor testimonies, such as historian Jochen Hellbeck, find frequently enough to consider it a real fact, although confined to the last days of the encirclement and corresponding only to a very small fraction of the men. Typhus, dysentery, and hepatitis spread rapidly in conditions of overcrowding, malnutrition, and impossible hygiene. Field hospitals installed in cellars and bunkers fill far beyond their capacity. Doctors work without sufficient anesthesia, without antibiotics, with deteriorated field instruments. Amputations due to frostbite become routine. Operations that in normal conditions would require careful preparation are performed with field saws on wooden planks under the light of oil lamps, without guarantees of post-operative survival. Diseases produced by the cold begin to add to the combat casualties in October before the closing of the encirclement. The soldiers of the Sixth Army, who expected to finish the campaign before autumn, lack adequate winter equipment. They do not have lined boots for temperatures of 30 degrees. They do not have gloves for work in extreme cold. They do not have caps with ear flaps. Frostbite first affects the fingers and toes, then the nose, then the ears. Field doctors perform thousands of preventive amputations of tissues already necrotized by the cold. Inside the kettle, the dead begin to accumulate in a different way than in the previous phase of the battle. They do not only die in combat, they die of cold while they sleep, they die of hunger in their positions, they die of disease in the field hospitals, they die in the bunkers. The intense cold freezes the corpses in hours, which delays decomposition but makes conventional burial impossible. The earth is frozen several meters deep. Tools break against the ground as if it were concrete. In some sectors, involuntary structures are formed with frozen corpses. The rigid bodies are stacked as if they were sandbags, used as improvised parapets or as protection against the wind. This detail, documented in several independent testimonies of German survivors collected in the 50s and 60s by the Federal Army Documentation Committee, illustrates to what extent the battle had dissolved any functional distinction between the living and the dead. The historian Jochen Hellbeck, who worked extensively with testimonies from both Soviet and German survivors in his research published in Stalingrad. The city that defeated the Third Reich collects descriptions of spaces where it was difficult to distinguish between sleeping men and dead men. The posture, the color of the skin in the extreme cold, the immobility. Some German survivors describe having slept leaning against corpses for warmth. There is a frontier that is crossed in those conditions, a psychological frontier that none of them was able to fully describe with words upon returning, because the words we use to describe death and the words we use to describe life were designed to refer to separate things. In the Stalingrad kettle, they had ceased to be so. The Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman, who covered the front for the Red Army newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, noted in his notebooks in the days following the capitulation what he saw upon entering the city. Grossman counted bodies from a single observation point. He measured the distances between corpses. He observed the mixture of uniforms, the German grey next to the Soviet khaki, in some postures that suggested that the two men had killed each other at the same time. His notes, published posthumously as part of the archives that the family managed to preserve, have value not only literary but also as a technical document. They are the first systematic description of the scale of the problem that the Soviet authorities are going to have to face. On January 10, 1943, Operation Ring begins the final assault under the command of General Konstantin Rokossovsky. Pitomnik airfield falls on January 16th. Gumrak, the last one, on the 22nd. On January 31st, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler the day before, in a gesture that was also an implicit order of suicide, surrenders in the basement of the Univermag department store. He is the first German field marshal to surrender in the history of the modern German army. The following day, the last pocket in the north capitulates, under General Karl Strecker. The battle has ended. The most solid academic estimates point to total Soviet casualties, including military and civilian, being between 750,000 and more than 1 million. German and Axis ally casualties, including Romanians, Italians and Hungarians, between 300,000 and 400,000 dead. Of the approximately 91,000 German prisoners who enter Soviet captivity in February 1943, only about 6,000 will return to Germany, most in 1955. The remaining 85,000 will die in the Soviet camp system. If one estimates conservatively 500,000 corpses in the area of operations with a weight of between 50 and 80 kilograms each, we are talking about between 25,000 and 40,000 tons of organic matter that must be collected, transported and disposed of in a completely destroyed city, without infrastructure, without functional equipment, and under extreme weather conditions. No one had planned for it. Planning it would have implied recognizing that the battle could last so long and cost so much, and no command on either side was in a political position to make that recognition out loud. In the first days of February 1943, temperatures remain extreme, between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. The bodies do not decompose, but they also cannot be buried because the earth is frozen several meters deep. This paradox, the cold that simultaneously preserves the corpses and paralyzes any attempt to give them burial, defines the first phase of the cleanup operations. The Soviet authorities issue the first cleanup orders in the second week of February. It is not an operation planned in advance. It is an emergency response to a health emergency that approaches with the speed of the calendar. Spring will arrive in weeks, and with the thaw will come the problems that the cold had kept in provisional suspension. The Soviet State Defense Committee, the body of maximum executive power during the war, issues specific directives to organize the operation. A local command hierarchy is established under the control of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which acts as the coordinating body for a sanitary engineering operation unprecedented in Soviet history. The city is divided into sectors. Each sector is assigned to a work brigade with specific responsibilities for the collection, transport, and disposal of remains. The available workforce has three main sources. The first are second-line Soviet troops, units that are not committed to active operations on other fronts and that are temporarily reassigned to the cleanup operations. The second are the civilians who begin to return to the city, attracted by the news of the victory or simply by the need to return to their homes if their homes still exist. The third, and quantitatively the most important, are the German prisoners of war. The use of prisoners of war in cleanup operations has a double logic from the Soviet point of view. On the one hand, it is efficient. there is a numerous and available labor force. On the other, it is appropriate in a sense that the Soviet authorities do not express in official documents, but which is evident in practice. The Germans who had killed the dead, who now populate the city, are the ones who collect them. From the point of view of international law, the employment of prisoners of war in work directly related to military operations was, at best, legally ambiguous. In the context of 1943, legal considerations had limited practical relevance. The Soviet Union had not adhered to the articles of the Geneva Convention of 1929 that regulated the treatment of prisoners in terms that would have established clear protections, and Germany had systematically violated those same conventions in the treatment of Soviet prisoners since the beginning of the war. The work is exhausting and brutal under extreme psychological conditions. The teams pick up bodies from the ground, drag them or transport them in sleds and carts to concentration points. The cold makes the bodies as rigid as boards, which complicates physical handling but reduces the impact of the odor. In some sectors, the bodies are so intermingled with German and Soviet uniforms together in the same trench in the same cellar that initial separation is impossible. They are collected together, and classification, when attempted, is performed later. Personal documents found on the corpses are collected by NKVD teams attempting to maintain some record of identities. Although in the prevailing conditions the process is inevitably chaotic. Wet, frozen and damaged documents deteriorate even further during handling. Identification photographs are unrecognizable. The identity medallions of Soviet soldiers, small black Bakelite cylinders that contained a paper form with personal data, present serious structural problems. Many soldiers had refused to carry them out of superstition, believing that carrying them was an omen of death. Others had lost them during the months of combat, in the Volga crossings, in the mud of the trenches. The internal paper had deteriorated with the humidity and the cold. The result is that a very high proportion of the Soviet dead cannot be identified at the time of collection. The exact figures for the percentage of identified dead were never published by the Soviet authorities, but estimates from later researchers point to less than 30% of the Soviet fallen in the battle being able to be identified with certainty in the cleanup operation of 1943. Identifiable Soviet fallen are buried in improvised military cemeteries or in collective graves with markers that allow for future identification. The unidentified are buried in mass graves without individual markers. This distinction between burial with a name and anonymous burial has consequences that project for decades. More than 100,000 Soviet soldiers from the Battle of Stalingrad still figure officially in the category of missing, and every year voluntary searchers recover some of them from the subsoil of the steppe. The real emergency arrives in March and April, when the hundreds of thousands of frozen corpses begin to thaw. In a city whose drinking water infrastructure is destroyed and whose sewer systems do not function, mass decomposition represents a direct threat of typhus, cholera, and dysentery. Soviet directives between March and May 1943 reflect that urgency. Additional brigades are mobilized, and German prisoners in condition to work are mass assigned to the collection operations. The brigades work in 12-hour shifts with rags soaked in pine oil as improvised masks. The smell of mass decomposition, described by participants as something that clings to clothing and persists weeks after contact, is the most consistent element in all testimonies of those who participated. Yuri Vlasov, a Soviet sanitation engineer whose testimony was collected by historian Alexander Samsonov in the 60s, described the work as mowing a field that never finished being mown. For the German prisoners who perform this work, the conditions accelerate an already catastrophic mortality. The Beketovka camp, the first concentration point for prisoners on the outskirts of the city, records several hundred deaths daily in the first weeks. In the first year of captivity, approximately 45,000 of the 91,000 prisoners die, dispersed through the Soviet camp system from the Volga to Siberia. They are Stalingrad dead who are not in Stalingrad. The epidemic crisis was avoided with effort through water chlorination campaigns, although the cases of typhus and dysentery in the area during 1943 and 1944 constitute an additional category of victims that rarely appears in official counts. There is a category of dead that no cleanup operation could address, those of the Volga. For 5 months, the river was the only corridor for supplies and reinforcements to the besieged city, crossed at night without lights, under constant fire from German artillery and aviation. Impacts sank entire barges. Soldiers who jumped into the water died of hypothermia in minutes in the waters of the Russian autumn and winter. The bodies sank in a deep river with a strong current, with a bed covered in sediment. They were never recovered. Post-war dredging operations to clear the navigation channel produced findings of armored vehicles, artillery, and ammunition. They also found human remains, but not systematically. The remains were buried in local cemeteries without identification. No one has been able to perform an inventory of the river bottom. Some researchers speak of tens of thousands of dead under the sediment accumulated in 80 years. What is certain is that they are there. The Volga poses an unsolvable problem of memory. The monuments are on land. The dead of the river have no possible physical marker. For the families of those who died crossing the Volga, there is no stone with a name, there is no hill with flowers, there is no place to go. Only the river, which flows exactly as before and exactly as now, without anything on its surface indicating what it keeps at its bottom, and it will continue to keep it. Among the dead of Stalingrad and its surrounding territories, there is a category that the dominant narrative, both Soviet and German, has tended to marginalize for decades. They are the soldiers of the Axis Allied armies who fought and died on the Southern Front in 1942 and 1943. Their deaths do not fit into the narrative of Soviet victory, nor in the mourning of German defeat. They remain on the margins of history, literally and geographically. The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, deployed on the flanks of the German 6th Army, were the first to receive the blow of Operation Uranus. The Romanian 3rd Army, with some 152,000 men in 9 divisions, defending a front of 140 kilometers along the Don, suffered nearly 90,000 casualties in the first 4 days of the Soviet operation. Its dead in the open field remained scattered across the steppe in an enormous area, lying on the same ground where Soviet fire had reached them, covered in hours by the snow that would preserve them for months, as if in a natural refrigerator. The Italian 8th Army, under the command of General Italo Garibaldi, suffered a similar fate during Operation Little Saturn in December 1942. Estimates of Italian casualties in that operation exceed 100,000 among dead, wounded and prisoners. The Hungarian 2nd Army was practically annihilated in January 1943 during Operation Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh, with similar losses in proportion. The Croatian soldiers who fought integrated into German units add another minority but real category to the list. The dead of these Allied armies were buried with even less systematization than the Germans. The Soviet authorities had no immediate political obligation regarding the fallen of the armies that had fought alongside Nazi Germany, and the resources available for cleanup operations were already insufficient for the German and Soviet dead. The Romanian, Italian and Hungarian dead were buried in collective graves on the steppe, often next to Germans or simply covered by the snow, without any record of precise location. The respective countries were in 1943 in conditions that made any management of their fallen in Soviet territory impossible. Romania and Italy were allies of a Germany that had just suffered the greatest disaster of its military history. Hungary would remain in the war until 1944. None of these countries had neither the resources nor the access to take care of their dead on the Soviet battlefield. The national search organizations of Romania, Italy and Hungary began to work on the location and recovery of the remains of their fallen only from the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the political changes in Eastern Europe. Access to Soviet archives is partial. The resources available are much inferior to those of the German Volksbund. The results to date are modest compared to the scale of the problem. In the Soviet prisoner of war camps, the Italians and Hungarians who survived the battle and fell prisoner suffered mortality rates similar to those of the Germans. Hunger, cold, disease, and extreme physical exhaustion made the difference in nationality in terms of survival relatively secondary. Their dead in the camps are scattered throughout the vast Soviet labor correction system in graves that in many cases were never accurately recorded. In February 1943, while the brigades collect corpses, Stalin has already made the decision. Stalingrad will be rebuilt as a visible symbol of the Soviet capacity for recovery. Reconstruction begins before the cleanup operation has finished, in areas of less damage on land that contains human remains, shrapnel, and millions of unexploded ordnance. Some of the sappers working on demining die in the process. Protocols demand stopping the work when remains are found, calling the NKVD and continuing later. In practice, given the volume of findings, identification was rarely possible. The city that emerges in the 40s and 50s is, in a literal physical sense, built over the dead. The Stalinist-style housing blocks are raised on grounds with human remains. Avenues pass over old battlefields. Pipes cross a subsoil that continues to contain what the 1943 collection did not reach. Since 1961, Volgograd is a modern city with nearly 1 million inhabitants whose construction projects must include by-law protocols for managing human findings. In September 2018, during work to divert a pipe, workers found a mass grave with the remains of 1,837 soldiers. They were moved to the Rososhka Cemetery and buried in September 2019, 76 years after their death. The previous year, during the preparation of the Volgograd Arena Stadium for the 2018 Football World Cup, workers found a German M40 helmet in good condition 1 meter deep. The modern stadium, where tens of thousands of people saw football matches, was built on a battlefield. This is not the exception. It is the normality of living in Volgograd. 37 kilometers northwest of the center of Volgograd, in the direction where the steppe extends toward the Don, there is a cemetery that looks like no other war monument in the world. The Rososhka Cemetery is divided by a road into two parts. To the left, the Soviet cemetery, inaugurated on August 23, 1998, with its 6-meter-high central sculpture representing a mother who weeps, the work of sculptor Sergei Sherbakov. To the right, the German cemetery, inaugurated on May 15, 1999. The two cemeteries face each other from opposite sides of the same road, in the same steppe where the men who now rest in them fought and died. The German side is conceived as a large bowl 120 meters in diameter, in which the dead sink instead of rising above the ground. The graves do not have crosses that rise toward the sky, but rather flat tombstones and black metal crosses that barely rise from ground level. The design transmits something that Soviet monuments do not transmit, cannot transmit. The position of those who lost, of those who cannot celebrate, of those who must honor their dead without triumphing through it. Around the central bowl, which is open and continues to receive new remains each year, there is a granite ring with the names of more than 120,000 German soldiers dead or missing in the battle. It is not a list of heroes, it is a list of the dead. The names are in alphabetical order. No military ranks are highlighted. There is no mention of decorations. Only names, birth dates, and death dates, and in many cases only birth dates because the death date could not be determined. The agreement between the Russian Federation and Germany that allowed the construction of this cemetery was signed in December 1992. The first burials took place in 1993. By the end of 2005, more than 48,000 soldiers had been moved from hundreds of different graves scattered through the region of Volgograd and Rostov-on-Don. The work continues. In 2019, 1,837 new remains were buried here, coming from the grave discovered the previous year during the pipeworks. The organization responsible for the maintenance and development of the cemetery is the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the German military cemetery service, financed mainly by private donations from German citizens. The Volksbund works in collaboration with the German Information Service on war casualties, the WAST, Wehrstammakt, which maintains the records of all German soldiers of the Second World War. The process that leads to each new burial is a chain of research that sometimes lasts years. Russian searchers, the poiskoviki, find remains in the field with their metal detectors and their manual excavations. If the remains show indications of being German, the Volksbund organization is notified. The remains are moved, examined in search of identity documents, identification tags, personal objects with inscriptions, or any other indicator. If identification is possible, it is attempted. If not, the remains are added to the cemetery as an unknown soldier with an approximate date. The collaboration between Russian and German teams in this work is, in the context of history between the two countries, a phenomenon in itself notable. Men and women whose grandfathers fought on both sides work together to recover the dead of a war in which their countries killed each other with unprecedented ferocity. Those who participate in this work consistently describe that something is built in that shared process that politicians and treaties cannot always build. A mutual recognition that the dead of both sides were human beings before being soldiers. In the spring, when the soil of the Russian steppe softens after the winter, groups of men and women head out to the fields with metal detectors, shovels, and basic field equipment. They carry maps of the battle, historical maps of positions, aerial photographs taken by the Luftwaffe and by Soviet aviation in 1942 and 1943. They look for the dead. They are the poiskoviki, the searchers. The movement was born almost spontaneously in the 70s and 80s when groups of volunteers, often young people, began to traverse the battlefields of the Soviet front looking for soldier remains. In the context of the late Soviet Union, the movement had a certain countercultural character. The official narrative glorified the heroes of the war in collective and abstract terms. The poiskoviki searched for individuals with proper names, with specific families, with personal stories that could complicate or enrich the official narrative. The Soviet authorities tolerated the movement but did not encourage it. A soldier who had died in conditions of defeat or confusion, who had been executed by his own side for cowardice or desertion, who had fallen as a prisoner into German hands before dying, did not fit easily into the story of the Soviet hero. The poiskoviki, by recovering individuals from collective anonymity, inevitably produced stories that the official narrative had not foreseen. With Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika in the second half of the 80s, the movement acquired greater visibility and increasing institutional legitimacy. After 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the partial opening of Soviet military archives, the search work accelerated considerably. Today, the Poiskovi Fond Rossi Search Front is the umbrella organization for dozens of regional groups operating throughout Russia. In the Volgograd area, the poiskoviki work every spring and summer in the battle zones. The techniques used range from prospecting with metal detectors and manual excavation to the use of more modern technologies such as infrared remote sensing, the analysis of digitized historical aerial photographs, and in some cases ground-penetrating radar. The results are significant. Every year, several hundred skeletons, sometimes more than 1,000, are recovered in the Volgograd area. Of these, only a small fraction can be identified. Those who carry a legible identification tag, who carry preserved personal documents, or who can be linked to unequivocal material remains. Most are buried as unknown soldiers in the military cemeteries of the region. The excavations have produced findings that go much beyond the simple recovery of remains. They have found personal diaries written in the final days before death, with entries that in some cases end mid-sentence. They have found letters that were never sent, folded and kept in the pocket of a frozen uniform, perfectly preserved by the ice for more than 80 years. They have found family photographs, the faces of wives, children and parents that the soldier carried with him to combat. They have found prayer books with marginal notes in tight handwriting, pipes with remnants of tobacco still in the bowl, tobacco boxes with engraved inscriptions that were farewell gifts. There is something deeply disturbing and at the same time moving in the fact that the cold has preserved these things for more than 8 decades, while the outside world continued to spin. A letter addressed to a mother, written the night before an assault that the soldier would not survive, remains in the uniform pocket for 81 years until a shovel finds it. The mother has been dead for decades, but the letter still exists, and sometimes there is a grandson or a great-grandson who can receive it. The process of notifying families when an identification occurs is, according to the Poiskoviki themselves, one of the most intense experiences of the work. When analysis of tags, documents, or DNA allows for linking remains to a name, the searchers and Russian military authorities initiate a process of locating relatives that sometimes requires months of research in the Ministry of Defense records, in municipal archives, and in war databases. In the Soviet case, that means tracing records that in many cases are incomplete, scattered in several archives, or directly lost. Many times, the identified soldier already has grandchildren or great-grandchildren who never knew their ancestor, but who receive the notification of their final whereabouts, with an emotion that the searchers themselves describe as one of the primary reasons they continue this work. There are Russian families who, for generations, have had in their house the photograph of a missing soldier, a grandfather from whom no news ever returned, and who decades later received the confirmation that that person now lies in the Mamayev Kurgan cemetery with their name engraved in stone. Lieutenant Sergei Voronov of the 13th Guards Rifle Division has been listed as missing since September 16, 1942. His granddaughter, Natasha Voronova, who in 2008 was 46 years old and lived in Saratov, received a call that year from a group of Poiskoviki from the Volgograd area. They had found her grandfather in a ditch north of the Mamayev Kurgan hill. They recognized him by an identification tag that for some reason, contrary to the superstitious custom of many, the lieutenant had carried with him. He was 26 years old when he died. Natasha was 2 when she was born in 1962, and spent her whole life knowing her grandfather had died in Stalingrad without knowing where. DNA analysis has transformed the possibilities of identifying remains from the Battle of Stalingrad in a way that would have been unthinkable 3 decades ago. The first DNA identification programs for Soviet fallen of the Second World War began in Russia in the early 2000s, initially with limited scope and comparatively rudimentary technology. Currently, the process is much more sophisticated. Advances in DNA extraction from highly degraded materials, including bones that have been in the ground for more than 80 years under varying conditions of temperature, humidity, and acidity, have considerably expanded the range of samples that can be successfully analyzed. Mitochondrial DNA, which is better preserved in ancient and degraded bone materials than nuclear DNA, allows establishing maternal lineage of remains with a degree of precision that makes comparison with samples from relatives through the maternal line possible. For the German dead, the DNA identification program is being driven mainly by the Volksbund and by the WAST. Databases of German relatives who have provided reference samples have grown thanks to awareness campaigns and digital platforms that allow recording genetic profiles from anywhere in the world. Every year, several dozen positive identifications are produced, a small number in relation to the total of unidentified, but which for the affected families has a meaning that goes far beyond the number. There are families who have spent 80 years without knowing what happened to their grandfather or their great-grandfather and who now receive an answer that no one expected could arrive. In the year 2021, the remains of non-commissioned officer Wilhelm Brandt of the 194th Infantry Division were identified in the Rososhka Cemetery after his great-granddaughter in Bavaria registered in the Volksbund database providing a DNA sample. Non-commissioned officer Brandt had disappeared in January 1943 during the last days of combat. His great-granddaughter, who in 2021 was 31 years old, knew where her great-grandfather was 78 years after his death. DNA has, however, limits that no technological advance can overcome. The most fundamental problem is the need for a living relative who can provide a reference sample. A soldier who died in Stalingrad in 1943 without having had children, whose parents and siblings have also died, whose nephews and grandchildren cannot be located or simply do not exist, cannot be identified by DNA even if his remains are recovered and the sample is of sufficient quality. This problem worsens with each year that passes. The probability that a relative capable of providing a reference sample exists decreases as generations succeed each other and families disperse, go extinct, or simply lose the memory of their missing ancestors. There is also a problem of scale that no available resource can solve in the short term. Tens of thousands of unidentified remains are buried in the cemeteries of the Volgograd region. Processing each of them through DNA analysis, comparing profiles with relative databases, and managing the notification process when a match occurs requires resources that the responsible bodies do not have. At this rate, researchers calculate that the complete identification of the recovered fallen could take several decades, and that is without counting those who have not yet been recovered. The problem of second and third generation memory adds another dimension to the challenge. The children of the soldiers who died in the battle are already mostly elderly or have passed away. Their grandchildren are active adults. Their great-grandchildren have grown up in a world in which the Second World War is history, not personal memory. The emotional connection that keeps alive the desire to know where the missing ancestor rests weakens with each generation. In 20 or 30 years, the question of where the great-grandfather who died in Stalingrad is will have less relevance for many families than it does now. There is a window of time that is closing, and the Poiskoviki and memory organizations know it. The identification work has not only technical but biological urgency. Every year that passes, the number of people who can provide a valid reference sample is reduced. In 1967, 24 years after the end of the battle, the Soviet government inaugurates the largest commemorative complex in Soviet history. The Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that for 135 days was the center of gravity of the battle, is transformed into a monument that no one in the world can ignore. The central figure is the statue known as Rodina Mat Zovyot, the motherland calls, a female figure 87 meters high from the base to the tip of the raised sword, sculpted by Yevgeny Vuchetich. For decades, it was the tallest statue in the world. The figure emerges from the top of the hill and is visible from dozens of kilometers away. The sword weighs 14 tons. The total figure weighs approximately 7,900 tons. The concrete and steel of which it is built sit on the earth of a hill where there are between 34,000 and 35,000 people buried. The complex includes the Pantheon of Glory, an interior circular room where the eternal flame burns under a giant bronze hand that holds it. The walls of the room are covered with the names of 7,200 soldiers who died defending the city. They are a small fraction of those who died here. The 200 steps that lead from the foot of the hill to the statue are one for each day of the battle. The access to the Pantheon is flanked by concrete reliefs representing combat scenes. The figures are heroic, angular, determined. There is at no point in the complex a representation of the cold, the hunger, or the decomposition. The visual narrative of the monument is that of the victory, not of what the victory cost. Under the hill, in the subsoil that visitors do not see, General Vasily Chuikov is buried, the only marshal of the Soviet Union buried outside Moscow. Also, there is the sniper Vasily Zaitsev, reburied here in 2006 after his remains were moved from his original place of burial. And there are the others, those who have no name on any plaque in the complex, those whom researchers calculate in the tens of thousands, those who are in the ground without an individual marker since 1943. In winter, the hill is green and cared for, with mature trees and well-maintained stone paths. In the months following the battle, the hill took years to recover vegetation because the density of shrapnel in the ground raised the temperature enough to prevent the growth of roots. The first winter after the battle, the hill remained black while snow covered the surroundings because the shrapnel generated enough heat to melt the snow that fell on it. The Mamayev Kurgan currently receives more than 2 million visitors a year. It is one of the most visited places in Russia. Tourist groups follow the paths, read the names on the walls of the Pantheon, photograph the statue against the Volga sky. Beneath their feet, between 34,000 and 35,000 people wait, most without names. The official Russian narrative of the battle has undergone significant transformations since the end of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet period, the battle was celebrated as a victory of the system, of the Soviet people under the guidance of the Communist Party. The dead were heroes who had consciously given their lives for a collective cause, and their individual sacrifice was dissolved in the collective triumph. After 1991, the official Russian narrative maintained the emphasis on victory, but added religious and national dimensions that the Soviet period had suppressed. The battle as a sacrifice of the Russian people for the ancestral land, with references to the Orthodox Church and to a historical continuity that goes beyond communism. What has not changed is the structural difficulty of integrating into any official narrative the anonymous dead, those who have no name on any wall, those whom the subsoil of the steppe continues to keep. The Poiskoviki work on the margins of that narrative, recovering those whom history cannot name because it does not know their names. Despite decades of research, continuous excavations, and the partial opening of archives, there are dimensions of the problem of the Stalingrad dead that remain without a definitive answer. They are the persistent mysteries, those that time has not resolved, and which in some cases it will never be able to resolve. The first is purely quantitative. Exactly how many dead were there? Figures vary according to source and methodology. The most rigorous academic estimates based on historiographical works that have partially accessed Soviet military archives place the total between 800,000 and more than 1 million between soldiers of both sides and Soviet civilians. But the uncertainty is genuine. Soviet archives, even those partially declassified after 1991, present gaps, errors, and contradictions that make a definitive figure impossible. Civilian casualties are especially difficult to estimate because the civil registration system collapsed on August 23, 1942, and was not reconstituted until long after the end of the battle. The second mystery is the complete location of the mass graves. It is known that collective graves exist in areas that have never been systematically prospected. Some testimonies from survivors and prisoners of war collected in the years following the battle mention burial sites that have never been found or that were left under subsequent construction. In the peri-urban area of Volgograd, there are zones in which the subsoil has not been investigated and which, according to researchers from the Search Front, may contain thousands of remains. The third mystery is the identity of the unidentified. In the military cemeteries of the Volgograd region, both in the Soviet one at Mamayev Kurgan and in the German one at Rososhka, there are tens of thousands of graves without a name or with incomplete identification. DNA analysis opens the possibility of eventually identifying some of these remains, but the process is long, expensive, and requires the collaboration of relatives who in many cases no longer exist or cannot be located. The fourth mystery is what exactly happened to the Soviet civilians who died during the bombings of August 1942 or during the months of urban combat. Estimates of civilian casualties vary even more pronouncedly than military ones. Many of these civilians were factory workers, women, children, and elderly people who were trapped in the city when the possibility of evacuation was closed. Their individual fate is in most cases completely unknown. There are no records, there are no documents, there are no witnesses who can name them. There is also a dark zone regarding Soviet prisoners of war captured by the Germans during the offensive phase prior to Stalingrad in the summer of 1942. The Sixth Army captured tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers during its advance from the Don toward the Volga, and the treatment of these prisoners by the Wehrmacht was generally brutal, with mortality rates in the transit camps that in some months exceeded 50%. Their remains are scattered somewhere between the Caucasus and the Volga, and practically none have been located or identified. The final figures of the Battle of Stalingrad are not closed. They continue to change every time an excavation adds bodies to the records. Every time a DNA analysis links bones to a name. Every time a declassified archive offers new data on units that were annihilated without anyone being able to record the casualties. The difference between the number of people who died in the battle and the number of those deaths that can be attributed to a specific individual, with a name, with a story, with a family, is a gap that history has not been able to close, and that probably will never close entirely. Every spring, when the soil of the Russian steppe softens after the winter, the searchers go out into the field. They carry metal detectors, shovels, maps of the battle, and the patience required to look for the dead in 80-year-old soil. They find bones, identification tags, wallets with documents, photographs that someone carried with them in the pocket of a frozen uniform in 1943. Every year they find more. Every year they identify some. Every year, somewhere in Russia, Germany, Romania, Italy, or Hungary, someone receives a call or a letter containing an answer to a question that in some cases is more than 80 years old. The great-grandfather who disappeared on the steppe. The grandfather from whom no news ever returned. The person in the photograph in the drawer who never had a known burial. The speed of identification work has accelerated in the last decade thanks to DNA and digital platforms that allow coordinating searches in multiple countries simultaneously. But the scale of the problem is such that researchers calculate it could take decades to complete the work, if it can ever be completed. There is something in the persistence of this problem that says something about the nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Previous wars left dead that could generally be counted, and over time, buried. The trench warfare of 1914 to 1918 had already introduced a scale of destruction difficult to manage, and the military cemeteries of Belgium and France are permanent testimony to it. But Stalingrad represents a different threshold. The combination of the destroyed city, the prolonged encirclement, the extreme cold, and the concentration of forces in a reduced space created a situation in which the dead simply exceeded the capacity of any human system to manage them in real time. It was not an administrative failure. It was the logical consequence of a type of violence that reached in Stalingrad its most concentrated and long-lasting expression. The battle demonstrated that modern industrial war could generate a problem of the dead that would last for generations, that each year of peace would add a new layer of history over the ground without resolving the underlying problem, that the work of recovering the fallen was in reality a task as long as the memory of those who waited for news. There is a final figure that summarizes all this better than any description. In the Volgograd area, after 80 years of excavations, after thousands of expeditions by the Poiskoviki, after all the DNA analyses and all the identifications, the number of fallen from the battle who remain officially in the category of missing or unidentified continues to be greater than 100,000 among the Soviets alone. And that is without counting the Germans, the Romanians, the Italians, the Hungarians, the civilians. The subsoil of Volgograd continues to keep those who are missing. Every spring, when the earth softens and the searchers return to the fields with their detectors and their shovels, a few more are recovered. And each recovery is at once a closing and a reminder that there are more, always more, still waiting under the silent steppe that covered all that more than 80 years ago and has not finished delivering it.